Hello, good morning, or whatever time it is. Oh, I suppose it's morning for many of you. Welcome to this talk on Repoinit. It's a pretty simple thing this time. I've been doing some exotic talks sometimes at adaptTo. This one is pretty down to earth on a pretty simple module, but which I think is interesting. My name is Bertrand Delacretaz. I'm from the French-speaking part of Switzerland on Lake Neuchâtel. I work for Adobe, attached to the Basel office as a principal scientist, working on the core of AEM, so to say, APIs and all that stuff. I've been involved in Sling since the beginning, so more than 10 years. So I'm guilty of some of that stuff, including the good stuff and there's the debatable stuff. So the talk is about, obviously, what's Repoinit, how to use it. But considering it's a pretty simple module, I thought, and also I like to tell stories. I thought I would also, explain a bit of the behind-the-scenes story, how it came to be, and thoughts on writing parsers. I'm a big fan of mini languages. I think you can do and I think Repoinit is a good demonstration of that. They are a very useful way of defining things, getting a common understanding of what we're doing. So I like creating languages, mini languages. I haven't created any major one. So that will be part of the story. And also I think the testing setup of Repoinit is interesting and has enabled some good contributions, made it easy to contribute to the code. As I said, it's a kind of a boots in the mud talk. So really, on something very concrete. There's no rocket science this time in this talk. It's all simple stuff, but I think and I hope it's interesting. So let's start. What is Repoinit? So it's an Apache Sling mini language for content repository initialization. So it is, in theory, it should be independent of the underlying content repository implementation. Most of the language is pretty abstract, but some of it is JCR specific because Sling is mostly based on Oak JCR. So some of the Repoinit statements are clearly tied to JCR, but many of them are not. Like that, the example that we see here, the text on this slide is a small excerpt of a Repoinit script setting ACLs, access control lists on /libs and /apps, allowing Alice and Bob to read that, and allowing content admins. So what is showing here on this slide, there's an excerpt of the Repoinit language, which is setting ACL on two paths, libs and apps, allowing read for users Alice and Bob, and JCR all for content admins, which is probably a group, but we don't see that here. The way it works, at JCR startup, so when the content repository is ready at the JCR level, before exposing it as an OSGI service for other parts of Sling to use it, we call a number of Sling repository initializers. I'll show that in the next slide, simple services. And one of them is the Repoinit, which executes these Repoinit scripts, similar to the one you see here. And only if this is successful, then the Sling repository service is registered and made available to the rest of Sling. The idea is that you want to make sure that some of these initializations happen before you expose the repository to others, to your application or even to Sling. So that was the key design goal, to make sure things happen before anything can be done at the application level, at the Sling level, to the repository. It's based on this simple service interface, Sling repository initializer, which has just one method, process repository. So this one gets a Sling repository service before it's exposed as an OSGI service, and it's the only way that you can grab it and set up initializations on the repository. And then if you have multiple such services, they are called in order of the service ranking, OSGI service property. So basically, if something's missing in Repoinit, you could do the same thing on yourself by implementing one or several of these services. And if any of these services throws an exception, the Sling repository service is not registered. So basically your Sling instance will not start. So the concept is that either things go well or you don't start your application at all. So this is the basic, inner workings or basic principles of what Repoinit does. History. So as I said, I like to tell stories, but I think it's the story of this module is a good one. It's interesting because it's not a fantastic, you're not going to have an article in the New York Times about Repoinit. It's a pretty basic, simple thing, but it's interesting because as you can see on this the graph on this slide, it has had sustained contributions till 2016. So it's been here for 5 years with continuous almost continuous stream of small contributions, regular, which means, it's an important thing. And if you look, okay, so I wrote most of the Repoinit code, but if you look at these contributions, many of them are from people who have not touched this module otherwise. They just needed one or two things and were able to do them by themselves by looking at other examples. So it's also, I think, a testimony of how the code is set up, the good test infrastructure, which makes it easy to verify that what you're doing makes sense and works. So I have links here on the slide to the main ticket that started that, where the statement was, we need to initialize a number of things when starting Sling on a new or existing content repository. So this was, the idea of doing things before exposing the service to Sling. And there's also a link to the discussion, which was pretty also very interesting in terms of community, with many people giving opinions and then converging of this design, which I find quite nice. The syntax, I had to dig in, and it comes from this JCR VLT ticket. And Tobias Boganegra, my colleague from Adobe, invented this very simple, very readable syntax, at least the basic style of that. And I think we can be thankful because it makes it very easy to understand the language and so on. Did I click in the wrong direction? No, it's good. So this is in slightly more detail how you use it. So the Repoinit repository initializer runs at Sling startup. You don't have anything to do for that to happen. Then it will grab Repoinit scripts from different places, including the OSGI feature model, which is probably the preferred way today of doing that. OSGI configs can also supply Repoinit script fragments, and they can also be supplied by URLs. Before we had the feature model, we had the Sling provisioning model, and then this could expose URLs to grab Repoinit scripts. So they can come from different places, always the simple text statements. And then, as I already said, so either the whole thing is successful and the Sling repository comes up as an OSGI service, or you fail loudly and your instance doesn't start, and hopefully then you will get error messages which explain why. So this is how you use it. Basically, you just use it. The standard way of using it is just supplying Repoinit scripts as part of your feature model. And you can see examples of that in the Sling codebase, in the Sling starter. I suppose the Sling CMS does the same thing. So that's a very common pattern. You can also, if you have a need for that, you can also easily parse Repoinit statements and execute them. This is a small, a code example which does that. You need two services. You need the parser, which returns operations, and then you need an executor to execute these operations. In this case, I'm using the JCR executor, which will do that on the Sling repository. And then you just call the parser on the text and returns list of operations that you apply with the processor, and then you save the JCR session yourself. Processor doesn't do that. These services come from two different modules. The parser is one module, and the JCR Repoinit is a different module. So if you have a need, you could also call these services explicitly, but generally it's meant for startup, setup and initialization. We're now going to look at examples of the syntax. You have all the syntax examples on the documentation page, but here I'm going to show and explain a few samples. It's pretty packed section. I can see the Q&A tab, so if you have questions, feel free to ask them already during this section, and I'll try to address them if they are make sense at this point. For once, I think we have good documentation. Also, it's easy because it's a simple module. It's just one page of documentation. But this page from the Sling website has everything you want to know about Repoinit, including the complete list of these example statements I will explain later, which come from the test suite. First example is creating path. If you have an empty repository, you probably need to create some path to store your contents. The first statement here is a very simple one. Just create a path with default node types. In the second one, I'm saying, okay, I want to create a path using a Sling folder as a default node type. The first part in brackets. I'm here on the second line example. And then the var/var/disk has an empty unstructured node type. So you can specify a default node type for parts of the path that you do not specify, and be more specific for some parts, as I'm doing here. The /5 example, third line, is using. You can also set mixins on path elements when creating paths, so it's pretty flexible. And then you can also, in more recent versions of these modules, you can set properties on specific path using different data types. You have examples here. There's two ways of setting properties. There's a set, which will set it whatever the current state is, and default, which only sets a property if it's not set yet. So in this example on path A, if there's already a sum long property, it will not be changed, and if there's no such property, it will be set to 42. So it's pretty flexible way of setting simple properties on the path. The goal is, and I'll talk about that when we talk about Repoinit versus content packages. The goal is really, it's really meant for initial setup of the repository. I don't think it would make sense to create your content, create text or things like that with Repoinit. It's really meant to create the initial structures, set up security, groups, service users, and those kinds of things. So I think we should see the path in that sense as well. Second set of examples, managing service users, normal users or service users. So the first one creates several service users, Bob, Alice, and Tom21. The second one creates a service user Leo with a path. You can define the path of the home folder of this user. A bit later on the create user AF, the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth example, create user AF is using forced path, meaning that if the user already existed with a different path, it's moved to this new path. Then you have, okay, I skipped, but going back, line 3, delete service user Leonardo and Winston 32. You can delete service users. Can also disable them with a message, explains why they are disabled. And then the last two examples, which we haven't seen yet, create user with a password. Okay, this one is not fantastic. It only supports plain text passwords for now. So it's really only for testing. Shouldn't do that for, for production, but it can be very useful in testing. And then the last one deletes a plain user C. Nothing special, but you can create, delete, and manage service users and normal users, which is really basic thing when you're talking about security. Same thing for groups. Create a group with a path, with a forced path. Same concept as for the users. And then you can add users to a group, add user 1, 2 to group D. You can remove users from groups. You can delete the group A. And you can also set properties. This is also a fairly recent addition. Set properties on an authorizable, meaning the path, the home path of that group or of a user. You can set specific properties on that without knowing, without explicitly knowing the path. You just ask the repository to resolve the path by itself. You can see, I think one of the good thing of Repoinit, it's a very obvious syntax. I could just show these examples and you would mostly understand what it's all about. Then moving to access control lists, you can either set access control lists for principals, the first example, set principal ACL for and principal names, saying, okay, what can principal 1 and principal do? Principal 2, what can principal 1 and principal 2 do? So they can do anything on /content. They can do namespace management if that exists on a repository, repository. It's a special way of setting a repository level properties, ACL, sorry. The second block, set ACL on home jack. Also, setting ACLs on the home folder of a user. Always same syntax. You can use restrictions to make the ACLs more narrow, following the JCR and OAK capabilities. And you can also delete ACLs or principal ACLs. So again, a fairly simple and explicit way of setting ACLs with a very readable and also important a diffable language. If you have these scripts in source code control in the Git repository, you can really see nice diffs when it changes, which is really cool for traceability and tracing the following the evolution of your system. When I showed my slides to the program committee, I think Stefan had this question: how big can a Repoinit script be? And is it a problem if there's too many operations? So I made a small example yesterday. You have the link at the end of this slide here at the bottom to generate a Repoinit script in a loop and then to execute the corresponding operations. And this, up to a certain number of repetitions of similar statements. This is pseudocode. It's not, it's not the actual code here, but so I'm generating basically 4 statements per iteration in my loop, creating a service user, creating a path, and setting ACLs on the principal, set ACL for, and also setting ACLs on a path. So on the right, you see the timings that I get. So it's on my MacBook. I have a 3-year-old MacBook a laptop, so nothing fancy. Here I went up to 5,000 iterations in my loop, which translates to 20,000 Repoinit operations once it's parsed. So the parsing is very fast, 100 milliseconds. The execution in this case took 23 seconds, so about 1,000 Repoinit operations per second, which I think is reasonable. And then if you run it again, one important aspect of Repoinit is that it's idempotent, so you can run the same scripts multiple times and it shouldn't do any harm. So in this case, if you run it again, it's much faster because the repository just sees that the things are already in place, so it doesn't need to do it again. Increasing the limit, I was starting to get into problems. It was starting to get much slower. I suspect it's because I'm only saving the session at the end of the execution. If you look at the script, you can see that. So maybe the transient space was becoming very big, and that might be a problem. You might need to structure things a bit differently to save the session more often if you want to execute many operations. If it's really for system setup, security and stuff, I think you shouldn't reach that amount of operations. But it was interesting to try. So conclusion is that the limitation is certainly the repository operations, which are the most costly thing. The parsing is fast, not a problem. And if we really wanted to execute many Repoinit operations, we might need to introduce a mechanism for intermediate saves of the JCR session to keep it, reasonably fast. So it was just an interlude to break this long section of Repoinit examples. So up until now, we saw the more abstract stuff, which might work the same on a different type of content repository, creating path, creating users, setting ACLs, access control. This is all, JCR independent, I would say. And you don't see JCR in that syntax mostly. Maybe the namespaces for permissions and stuff, but it's very limited. Now we have an example which is totally JCR dependent. It's the node types and namespaces. So you can do that using the standard OAK CND syntax for these statements. It just has an escape with the weird arrows that you see here. I needed that because otherwise the parser would get confused with all the weird characters that are in this syntax. So basically, you can include blocks of CND syntax in your Repoinit scripts to create node types and namespace is just to register namespace, as we see here. But Repoinit can interpret CND syntax in fragments, such as we see here. Can also register JCR privileges. This is again really JCR specific. And that's it. So in summary, you can create path, you can manage users, you can manage groups, you can set ACLs on path or delete ACLs. You can register JCR node types and namespaces and register privileges. One question that came up in the slides review is, oh, you can create path, but you cannot delete them. This is a discussion we're having. Deleting a path could be costly if you have many things under that path. So we want to be careful how we do that. Maybe set limits. It's still under discussion. We haven't done that yet. So that's it for the syntax section to explain exactly what you can do. And then also, this was also a question, I think, from Stefan in the slides review, Repoinit versus content packages. Again, I don't think there's an absolute answer, but I'll try to do my best here. So the benefits of Repoinit that I see is that it's diffable, as I said. So if you have the Repoinit scripts in your Git repository, you can see the evolution, which is, I think, very important when it's about security and users and groups and stuff. So it's very traceable. Another key point about Repoinit is that failures in Repoinit scripts prevent startup. So if anything wrong happens during execution of Repoinit statements, you don't get a Sling instance, which is good, if it's about security, to make sure things happen or not. So I think to me, these are the key points that speak for Repoinit. The content packages, it's much easier if you have a complex content structure, if you have binary files, if you have textual content. I think it's much more convenient to provide that in a content package. Content packages also allow project modularization. Maybe you can also do that with Repoinit because the Repoinit statements are in feature model files. So it's also modular, but content packages, you could argue, maybe are a bit more separated. I think my conclusion would be that Repoinit is really meant for repository setup, creating the initial path structures, setting access control on them, creating groups, service users, and all that. And content packages would be for actual content. I'm happy to discuss at the end if there are different opinions, but that would be my recommendations. And now, okay, so this is it for the really functional view of Repoinit. But as I said, I wanted also to talk about the history and how it's created under the hood. And I think one good lesson that I learned by creating and maintaining that module is that if you're writing a parser, you shouldn't do it by hand unless you know exactly what you're doing. Very often we have to pass stuff, and you start writing code and say, oh no, it's pretty easy. I will just write the recursive descent parser, or do it by hand, regex, and everything. It will work. It might initially work, but I'm not sure if it will be maintainable, if it will be easy to get contributions from others. And in this respect, I think for me, using a parser generator for Repoinit has made a huge difference. I'm using a very basic one, a Java CC, which is maybe the most basic parser generator you can have in Java. The advantage is that it doesn't have any runtime requirements, so it doesn't blur your dependency graph. That's cool. And the syntax, there's an example here. So basically, the grammar file of the parser is a mix of grammar, grammar statements, and simple operations that will delegate to services which are in the background, so to say. So, for example, here you say, okay, if I have a delete ACL for literal keywords, and then I look for a principles list, which is another parser production, which will do the analysis of the principles list, and then either end of line or end of file. Then I add to the result a delete ACL principles operation. So I think it's a nice mix of grammar and executable code. And if you look at the Repoinit grammar file in the source code, it's reasonably readable. And you have many examples for Java CC, so I think that's doable. I'm linking here. The link at the bottom of this slide is to an article by Phil Eaton about how the parsers or how the languages that we are using are how their parsers are written for GCC, for Clang, for Ruby, and everything. You have some screenshot on the right. And actually, many of these parsers are written by hand, for the big languages where the parser is really the core of the thing. So it's really important. So in this case, it might be worth writing a parser by hand. If you're writing a small parser for a mini language, I would say, no, don't do it by hand. Really use a parser generator. And the Antler is maybe the best, the most well-known in Apache. It's fantastic. I've used it as well in other projects. And Java CC for me is a nice, kind of simple, a bit old-fashioned, but it works really well. And another aspect that I wanted to expose is the test-driven software, how the Repoinit test suite is structured. And I think this has also made a huge difference in terms of getting contributions, except for the basic core mechanisms. All the parser syntax is tested by test files, which are just textual, small Repoinit scripts. And you have one file for the input and one file for the expected output. Very simple stuff. You have a number of these files in the test folder, and if you add one, it's picked up automatically. So it makes it very easy to add new tests. So if you're adding a new language feature, basically you don't touch anything that's existing. You add your new test input and an output file that matches it, and that's it. So basically adding a new language feature means modifying the grammar file based on examples that are in there, adding one text file as an example and one text file for the expected output, and you're good. So, and if you see some of the contributions that have been done, many of them are just that, 3-4 files, small changes, not touching anything existing except the grammar file. And I think it's a cool way of enabling contributions. And then what happens is that to generate the documentation page that I was showing, it has a long list of test example statements, and these are just a concatenation of these test files. So you know that the documentation page is up to date because the instructions are taken from the actual tests. So I think it's a really nice way of keeping things in sync and having decent documentation for your software. And voila, that's what I wanted to say. So we've seen how Repoinit works. We've seen the syntax, what you can do, and also these three aspects on why I think it's a successful project and the elements that have helped made it a successful project. Even if it's a small thing, it's a very important one, I think. and it's good for it to be good quality and hackable to get good contributions. I think we have 10 minutes left for questions. So let me look at the questions. The first one from Yegor. Hi, Yegor. Good to see you here. It's not the first in the order, but I'll take it back because it's an easy one for me to answer. How does Repoinit handle exceptions? Will it roll back the entire script? Actually, yes, because the session, I think I should check that, but I think the JCR session is only saved at the end of the whole execution. So yes, the changes will be a rollback, and that should be the case. So maybe I should add test to make sure that's the case. But yes, that's the intention. So either things happen and they're fine, or nothing happens. A question from Lars. Can you copy a path or subtree and modify something within? No, you cannot copy. You can create, you cannot even delete. So no, we don't have operations to do that. Again, if you really need that for a special case, like you're migrating content, you might implement a Sling repository initializer service and do that, because then you can do, you get a JCL session and you can do everything. So I think we should keep Repoinit focused on the really setup operations and then leave hooks like we have now for the more complex operations. The first questions that was asked by Gaurav, how is Repoinit different from ACS command on deploy scripts? So the first two I don't know at all, I'm sorry. And AC tool from NetCentric, my understanding is it's a nice tool for to set up ACLs, so access control. Maybe it's better than Repoinit, I don't know. But Repoinit is a bit broader. I don't know. I'm not sure if that tool does also creating paths and stuff. So yeah, really, I don't know these tools well enough to answer that question. And if there are things that need to be added, yeah, Repoinit will be open for contributions if you think something is missing. Opening the next question, are the scripts run automatically during package installation? So no, the scripts, Repoinit is completely distinct from content package installation. The Repoinit scripts are executed before any content package is installed, because when Repoinit runs, the Sling repository service is not visible to the rest of Sling, so it's completely decoupled. Is it possible to run a script only for a specific run mode? I think you could do that by setting it up that way in the feature model. I'm not sure. That's how you could do it. Otherwise, no. All the scripts are executed, in one go. And next question. Do you recommend Repoinit as a default tool for managing group permissions? I think, yeah. I think that's Repoinit's strength, really. The ACLs, the groups, managing groups, and setting ACLs on path. I think that's where Repoinit shines, especially because of the diffability of the scripts. The scripts are simple text file, and it's really easy to review them, to audit them if you want, and view the evolution. So yes, I think that would be my recommendation. I think that's it for the questions that we had in the tool. Let me see something in the chat that I need to address. Oh, Jörg answered the ACS AM comments. Thank you very much, Jörg. And Carsten confirmed that Repoinit per run mode is possible. So it's great to have friends in the chat. Thank you. I see one more question arriving. So Jörg, should I use Repoinit to also create and maintain business users and business groups? I think so. I think, again, it makes the whole thing traceable, at least for the groups. For the users, depends how you organize. But yeah, I would say, yeah, in general, I would use Repoinit for everything, everything that has to do with groups and access control. Next question. I had a clicking problem. It's coming. Yeah, Lars, is it compatible with AEM as a cloud service? Yes, that's actually. I think we've been moving a lot of stuff to Repoinit from content packages to, especially around the security stuff. So yes, definitely, it's first class citizen there in the AEM as a cloud service, which is good given all the work that we did on it. And Oliver, hi, nice to see you, Oliver, even if we don't see each other. No discussions around naming issues. Would you do it differently if starting from scratch? Naming is actually very important to me when I write software, and I think the Sling committers can confirm that. I can be persistent about that's not the right name. Repoinit, is that the stupid name? Maybe, I don't know. The good thing is that it's unique. I suppose, I hope if you search on the web Repoinit, you will not find anything else. So for me, having a unique name for a product or a tool is extremely useful, even if the name itself is not fantastic. So yeah, I don't want to rename it. I think rename it is a bad thing that large companies do too often. So no, I would not rename it. But the name is, I agree that the name is not very poetic, but it's unique, which I think is very useful. I have more in the chat. Okay, so Dominic suggests sharing more details in the Meet the Expert session. Thank you very much, Dominic. So that's a very good way for people to get more information if you want. And apart from that, Dominic is asking a question. We are out of time, so I'll answer the question and maybe it goes to the bin, but let me do that. Shifting permission handling to later phase of repository initialization after installing content packages. Yeah, it might make sense because the path might not exist in Repoinit. That's a good point. We might do that in several phases. First time I see this idea, but it might be useful. I agree. There's nothing in the works for that right now, but that sounds like it might be a good idea. Okay, so we're out of time. I can stay in the chat here. Thank you very much for attending this session. I hope it was useful. And it's good for once to do a boots in the mud session and not be on some exotic stuff. Thank you very much.